On her birthday, the mother sat waiting for a hug. Instead, the adopted son handed her a one-way ticket to a nursing home. Just 1 week later, Big Shaq walked through those same doors, not for a visit, but for a reckoning. What began as betrayal became a storm of truth. And when Big Shaq moved, lives didn't just change, they rose. This wasn't charity, this was justice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung kindly over the quiet curve of Parkhaven Drive, casting a gentle warmth on flower beds and freshly swept porches. There was something almost cinematic in the way wind brushed through the tall sycamore trees, their leaves whispering promises of joy. On the corner lot, a modest cream-colored house stood dignified, its windows lined with cheerful curtains and old potted plants. Inside, Eleanor sat alone at her kitchen table, a soft-spoken woman wrapped in a lavender cardigan. Her hands, veined and delicate, rested near a half-eaten slice of lemon cake. A single candle still flickered at its center, its wax pooling near the edge like tears on porcelain. She'd baked the cake herself. 68 wasn't a landmark birthday, but it mattered. All birthdays did, especially when most of your friends had stopped having them. The house echoed with quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the hollow kind. The kind that only deepened when Eleanor looked at the door, waiting for the sound of her son's footsteps. Then, finally, Drew arrived. The front door opened with a confident thud, and in walked a man dressed sharp in navy slacks and a tailored shirt, phone still glued to his ear. Drew had a sort of effortless charm that could win strangers in seconds. Tall, manicured, a salesman's smile that didn't always reach his eyes. He kissed his mother on the cheek without breaking his call, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and ended the call with a quick, "Yeah, I'll close by Tuesday. Easy." Eleanor smiled, though her eyes had already started to lose their shimmer. "I saved you the last slice." Drew looked at the cake and then at her. "Meow. We need to talk." The words landed wrong. Eleanor felt it immediately. She folded her hands on her lap, bracing, but still hoping. "I've made some decisions," he continued, tone businesslike, "and it's time you had a little more care." Eleanor blinked. "Care? You've been alone too much," he said, walking past the cake like it was invisible. "You've had some health scares, and honestly, Ma, the house, it's a lot for you to handle. Don't argue, please. I've already arranged everything." She didn't say a word. She didn't cry, didn't protest, just sat there as Drew handed her a pamphlet. Sunset Pines, Assisted Living with Dignity. On the cover, an elderly couple smiled by a window that didn't belong to any real home. "I packed a few of your things. They'll help with the rest," Drew said, glancing at his phone again. "They'll be here in an hour." Eleanor looked at her cake, that sad, uneven thing she'd spent the morning frosting with arthritic fingers, and tried to make sense of it. Her birthday, her son, her house, all gone in the space of a paragraph. The car ride was short and silent. Drew had opted for a black town car rather than drive her himself. No music played. Eleanor kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, clutching the last bit of control she had. Her silence, her dignity. The nursing home loomed like a medical office disguised with shrubs. Sterile, clinical, uninviting. As the car pulled away, and Eleanor stood under the false cheer of a welcome home banner, something in her settled. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of stillness. The kind that grows in the quiet after betrayal. Across the city, in a different world of laughter and noise, Shaquille O'Neal stood at the center of a community basketball court. Kids swarmed around him like satellites to a sun, eyes wide, phones out, sneakers squeaking on the asphalt. He was in his element, not as a legend, but as a big brother, a friend, a giant with a gentle heart. He'd just wrapped a charity event with his foundation. Backpacks for underprivileged kids, hot meals, and a lot of smiles. The sun was dipping, painting the court in golden hues, and Shaq took a long breath as the last few kids hugged him goodbye. "Another one for the books, huh?" his assistant Connor said, checking his watch. "You good to head out?" Shaq nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's swing by Mama's first. I got her some of that peach cobbler she likes." Connor grinned. Always. Shaq had his rituals. He never missed a chance to check in on his mama, Lucille, the woman who'd raised him right, who'd built his soul long before fame filled his pockets. To Shaq, showing up wasn't a duty, it was a code. As the SUV rolled through the city, past murals of forgotten faces and boarded-up storefronts, Shaq noticed a small crowd outside a local diner. An elderly man was being denied service. Something about loitering. The man looked confused, holding a crumpled dollar bill in his shaking hand. Shaq told Connor to pull over. He got out, walked up slow. "What's going on here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The manager stuttered, recognized him instantly, tried to smooth it over. "Misunderstanding, Mr. O'Neill. The gentleman didn't order." Shaq turned to the man. "You hungry?" The man nodded, embarrassed. Shaq pulled out a crisp 20. "You get whatever you want, and sit anywhere you like." It wasn't much, but it was everything. That was Shaq's way. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just right. Back at Sunset Pines, Eleanor sat on a bed that wasn't hers, staring at beige walls, lined with generic art. The room smelled of antiseptic and old linens. A nurse had introduced herself with a flat smile, then promptly disappeared. Dinner had come and gone, untouched on the tray. She opened the drawer beside her bed. No family photos, no letters, no sense of home, just a pamphlet, now folded and worn at the edges. And so began her week of silence. Unbeknownst to her, fate was already in motion. A ripple had started across town in the form of a man with size 22 shoes and a heart as wide as the world. Their lives hadn't intersected yet, but when they did, nothing would be the same. The sun set over the city as streetlights flickered on. Eleanor lay in bed, listening to the slow hum of a world that had moved on without her. Across the city, Big Shaq sat on his mother's porch, laughing with Lucille over cobbler and old stories. Two souls, two houses, two worlds about to collide. And in between them, the truth waiting to surface, the lies waiting to burn, and a storm just beginning to gather. The first night Eleanor spent at Sunset Pines felt like an exile wrapped in soft sheets. The walls were paper thin, letting in muffled coughs, restless shuffling, and the low murmur of late-night television from neighboring rooms. She tried to close her eyes, tried to tell herself this was temporary, but the ache in her chest didn't soften. She missed the creak of her old floorboards, the stubborn kitchen window that always stuck halfway, the way the light poured across her backyard each morning. Here everything was uniform. Even the dawn felt borrowed, spilling into a room that didn't know her name. The staff at Sunset Pines wore crisp scrubs and polite smiles, but Eleanor could feel it, the way they breezed past her room with distracted nods, the way they spoke to her like she was fragile and slow, as if her quietness was proof of decline. She noticed the subtle shifts too, how they responded differently to residents depending on their skin tone, how Black and Hispanic elders were sometimes spoken to with sharp, clipped tones, while she, a white woman, was given a thin veneer of politeness that barely masked impatience. Yet even with that, Eleanor felt invisible, alone. Breakfast was always rushed. The eggs rubbery, the coffee lukewarm. Eleanor sat at the far end of the dining hall, trying to engage the woman next to her. Delilah, a sprightly black woman with keen eyes, but the staff interrupted before they could settle into conversation, hurrying Delilah off for an urgent health check. It became a pattern. Anytime Eleanor tried to connect, someone or something cut the moment short. She began to wonder if it was deliberate. She began to wonder if she mattered at all. Meanwhile, Drew reveled in his newfound freedom. Back at Eleanor's house, the old place had transformed. The cozy little home, where Eleanor had once baked pies and tended roses, was now unrecognizable. Music blasted through expensive speakers. Strangers spilled drinks on the hardwood, and Drew moved through the chaos with the swagger of someone who believed himself untouchable. He'd told himself, and others, that he'd done the right thing. "My mom's where she needs to be," he declared loudly, laughing as he popped open another bottle of champagne. "She's better off." In truth, Drew felt relief. No more worrying about bills. No more visits where he had to feign patience. No more pretending to care about a woman he saw only as a burden. The house, the money, the freedom. It was all his now, and he planned to enjoy every last drop. Across the city, in a world Drew rarely thought about, Big Shaq was deep in preparation for another charity event. He stood in the heart of a bustling community center, surrounded by volunteers and local leaders, mapping out logistics for a weekend drive that would deliver school supplies to underfunded districts. Shaq's presence was electric. Wherever he went, people gravitated toward him, not just because of his fame but because of his heart. He listened, really listened, when people spoke, and when he promised to help, he followed through. It was during one of these planning meetings that Shaq first heard Eleanor's name. A young volunteer named Jesse approached him cautiously. Hey Shaq, there's something you might want to know. There's this lady Eleanor at Sunset Pines. She got dumped there last week by her son. On her birthday, no less. Shaq's brow furrowed. Dumped? Jesse nodded. Yeah, it's been going around. Some of the nurses talk. She's sweet, from what I hear. But nobody visits. Her son took off, threw a party at her place the same night. Shaq felt a strange tightening in his chest. He didn't know why this story, out of all the stories, hooked into him. Maybe it was because he was raised by a mother who'd sacrificed everything. Maybe it was because he'd seen too many people cast aside once they were no longer useful. Or maybe it was something deeper, a pull he couldn't explain, like the universe nudging him towards something unfinished. For the next few days, Shaq couldn't shake the thought. He went through the motions of his charity work, smiling for photos, shaking hands, packing backpacks, but Eleanor's story stayed lodged in the back of his mind. He found himself wondering, what kind of son leaves his mother on her birthday? What kind of loneliness fills a room when the people who should love you most walk away? Back at Sunset Pines, Eleanor passed the days in quiet routine. She read books from the tiny library, watched birds from her window, and kept mostly to herself. There were moments when she wanted to scream, moments when she wanted to call Drew and demand to know why. But pride kept her still. Pride and the painful realization that she already knew the answer. One afternoon, Eleanor overheard two staff members whispering just outside her door. "Did you see who's been asking about her?" One nurse murmured. "Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq. Can you imagine?" The other nurse laughed. "Yeah, right. What would a guy like him want with her?" But Eleanor heard it. And for the first time all week, something stirred in her chest besides sorrow. In his downtown office, Shaq sat at his desk, staring at a slip of paper with Eleanor's name on it. He drummed his fingers thoughtfully. Connor leaned in, eyebrows raised. "You really gonna visit her? You've got 10 appearances this weekend alone." Shaq smiled faintly. "Yeah, but none of those feel as urgent." There was something about the situation that gnawed at him. He couldn't stand injustice. Not on the court, not in life. And the more he learned about Eleanor, the more he felt sure something wasn't right. Not just the abandonment, but the deeper layers. The quiet racism at the home. The subtle erasure of a woman who'd lived a full life, only to be dismissed when she no longer fit someone's plan. By the end of the week, Shaq made up his mind. "Clear my Sunday," he told Connor. "Why?" Shaq smiled. "I need to meet someone." As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the last light fade. She'd stopped expecting visitors. She'd stopped expecting anything. But in the stillness, she felt, just barely, the tiniest flicker of something. Not hope, exactly, but a shift, a breath, the sense that somewhere out there, someone was moving toward her, even if she didn't know why. And that was the thing about Big Shaq. When he decided to step into someone's life, everything changed. Not because he was a celebrity, not because he was rich, but because he showed up fully, heart and soul. By the time Sunday rolled around, the story of Eleanor's week of silence was no longer just her own. It was about to collide with a force she never could have imagined. And in that collision, the first sparks of justice were about to fly. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting a bronze glow over the polished hood of Shaq's massive black SUV as it pulled up outside Sunset Pines. The engine rumbled to a stop, and for a moment, the quiet suburban street seemed to hold its breath. People rarely came here outside of visiting hours, and no one, certainly no one, like Shaquille O'Neal had ever stepped through its doors. Inside the nursing home, the staff moved with practiced efficiency, but when the front desk receptionist caught sight of the towering figure approaching, clipboard in hand, her mouth fell open. Nurses peeked from behind hallway corners, aides straightened their uniforms, and the head administrator nearly tripped over his own shoes rushing to greet him. "Mr. O'Neal, what an unexpected honor," the administrator stammered, offering a clammy handshake. Shaq took it lightly, but didn't miss the quick flicker of panic behind the man's eyes. The kind of flicker that told him everything wasn't as polished as it appeared. Shaq's face remained calm, almost unreadable, but his eyes swept the lobby, in one smooth, assessing glance. He saw the hurried attempts to tidy magazines on the coffee tables, the way staff nervously darted glances at one another. The undercurrent of tension that rippled through a place used to being ignored. He gave a slow, measured nod. "I'm here to see Eleanor." The name seemed to ripple through the room. The administrator forced a tight smile. Oh, of course. Eleanor, yes, we're very proud to care for her here. But Shaq could hear it, the slight wobble in the man's voice, the too eager tone. Shaq wasn't a man easily fooled by appearances. Years of fame had taught him to spot the cracks. As they led him down the hallway, Shaq felt the shift in atmosphere. Some residents peered curiously from their rooms, faces lighting up in recognition. Shaq offered a few gentle nods. A smile here, a wink. He knew his size filled a space, but he also knew how to make himself approachable. That was his gift, the ability to break tension without a word. Finally, they stopped at Eleanor's door. The administrator gestured stiffly. She's right in there. I'll, give you two some privacy. Shaq gave a single nod, waited for the man to retreat, and then gently knocked. Inside, Eleanor sat by the window, a thin shaft of light, tracing her silver hair. She was knitting, slowly, carefully, her fingers moving with the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of practice. For a moment, she didn't look up. Eleanor? Shaq's voice was soft, almost careful. She turned, eyes widening slightly. For a heartbeat, she just stared, trying to reconcile the towering figure in her doorway with the face she'd seen 1,000 times on TV screens and magazine covers. Then, a small, surprised smile touched her lips. Well, now, she murmured, setting her knitting aside. I wasn't expecting you. Shaq stepped into the room, ducking slightly to clear the low doorframe. He crossed the space in 3 strides but slowed as he reached her, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. I heard about what happened, he said quietly. I wanted to meet you. Eleanor gave a soft, bittersweet chuckle. I'm not sure what there is to meet, Mr. O'Neill. I'm just an old woman who outlived her usefulness. Shaq frowned, the lines around his eyes deepening. Don't say that. Eleanor's eyes glistened faintly. She took a slow breath, folding her hands in her lap. My son said I'm too much work. Her voice cracked just slightly on the words. Though she kept her shoulders square, her back straight, there was a quiet dignity in her, the kind Shaq had seen before in his own mother, in people who'd weathered storms most others couldn't imagine. Shaq reached out, resting one massive hand lightly over Eleanor's frail fingers. Your son's wrong. His voice was gentle, but carried a weight that filled the room. You're not too much. You're never too much. For a moment, Eleanor just sat there, eyes fixed on their joined hands. When she finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Not quite hope, but the barest spark of curiosity. Why are you here? She asked softly. Shaq gave a small, lopsided smile. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. And it was true. All week, her story had clung to him, shadowing his thoughts during meetings, tugging at his heart in quiet moments. It wasn't just the betrayal, though that alone was heartbreaking. It was the silence that followed, the way people like Eleanor were tucked away, their stories cut short, as if their lives had reached a closing chapter they hadn't chosen. Shaq stayed for over an hour, listening as Eleanor spoke in slow, measured sentences. She told him about her garden, the one she'd loved but hadn't been able to tend in years. She spoke of her late husband, a man she'd adored despite his stubborn streak. She spoke hesitantly at first, of Drew, the son she'd adopted as a baby, raised with care only to be cast aside when he saw her as an inconvenience. Shaq didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He just listened, his presence solid and grounding, like an anchor in a storm. And Eleanor, who hadn't had anyone truly listen in months, maybe years, found herself unfolding piece by piece, her sorrows surfacing alongside small memories and moments of resilience. As evening shadows lengthened across the room, Shaq rose, careful not to let the moment feel rushed. I'm coming back, he told her quietly, and we're going to fix this. Eleanor gave a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. Mr. O'Neill, I'm not sure what there is to fix. Shaq's eyes darkened, his mouth set in a determined line. Trust me, there's more than you know. When he left the room, the staff tried to crowd him again, all smiles and shallow charm. But Shaq's face had shifted. He wasn't here to play nice. He'd seen too much in that room. Too much neglect. Too much loneliness masked by surface politeness. He gave the administrator a nod that was all steel, all quiet warning. Outside, as Shaq climbed into his SUV, Connor was waiting. Well? Shaq exhaled slowly, gaze fixed on the road ahead. There's more going on here, Connor. I can feel it. Connor raised a brow. You thinking what I'm thinking? Shaq's jaw tightened. Yeah. We're digging deeper. As they pulled away from Sunset Pines, the nursing home's lights faded behind them. Inside, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the last streaks of daylight fade into the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. Somewhere out there, a storm was gathering. Not one she feared, but one she welcomed. Because sometimes, change doesn't come loud and violent. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a man who listens when no one else will, who sees past the polite smiles to the truth beneath. And Eleanor knew in the quiet of that evening that her story wasn't over, not yet. Shaq sat in the corner booth of a quiet coffee shop downtown, his enormous frame hunched over a tiny porcelain cup that looked almost comical in his hands. Across from him, Connor scrolled furiously on his tablet, eyes darting as he read through a fresh set of search results. The usual buzz of the cafe, people chatting, phones buzzing, the hiss of the espresso machine, barely touched Shaq's focused state. He was already deep into the problem, every part of him tuned sharply to the signals Connor was unearthing. Connor finally looked up, eyes sharp. "You were right to ask me to dig." He slid the tablet across the table. "Drew isn't just cutting corners or making a few bad decisions. He's actively gutting Eleanor's life behind her back." Shaq's fingers hovered over the screen, his expression darkening as he took in the documents. There were property transfers, quietly filed, transferring Eleanor's long-owned home directly into Drew's name, even though Eleanor was still alive and fully entitled to control over it. Worse, there were records showing Drew had accessed an old life insurance policy left by Eleanor's late husband, a policy Eleanor never even knew existed. And the money, gone, pulled into an offshore account, carefully disguised, funneled out in small, unnoticeable amounts over the past year. Shaq exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "How long has this been going on?" Connor leaned forward. "At least a year, maybe more." Drew's smart, he covered his tracks well. But there were slip-ups, small ones, payments to shady brokerage accounts, unexplained withdrawals. When I cross-referenced them with Eleanor's old home records, it lit up like a warning sign. Shaq leaned back in his seat, arms folded across his chest, staring hard at the window. Anger simmered quietly under his skin, not the kind that demanded fists or shouting, but the deep, steady kind that settled into his bones. This wasn't just a neglectful son. This was theft, betrayal, a full dismantling of a woman's life, carried out under the mask of family. "I want everything," Shaq murmured. "Every document, every transfer, every account linked to Drew." Connor nodded, already pulling up files. "I'll get it all." The plan was starting to take shape in Shaq's mind. Piece by piece, he knew better than to storm in, guns blazing. This wasn't a basketball court where sheer strength could force an outcome. It was delicate, strategic. Drew was crafty, slippery. If Shaq wanted to help Eleanor, he had to be smarter. That night, Shaq sat in his home gym, working through slow, heavy reps. Not for the physical payoff, but to clear his mind. He thought about Lucille, his mother, and how she'd taught him the value of steady patience. "You don't win every fight by swinging first," she used to say. "You win it by knowing when the other side will trip." Shaq let that wisdom settle deep, forcing himself to hold back the fire rising in his chest. Meanwhile, across town, Drew was slipping deeper into his schemes. He sat in Eleanor's old living room, though he'd remodeled it now, stripped away her floral furniture, her delicate antiques, replaced everything with sleek, modern lines and cold surfaces. Music pulsed through the house as Drew scrolled through listings on his laptop. He wasn't just selling the house, he was preparing to flip it for a profit, talking with brokers, making arrangements Eleanor knew nothing about. He wore his success like armor, convinced he'd pulled off the perfect escape. But he underestimated the size of the shadow moving toward him. The next morning, Shaq made another visit to Sunset Pines. He arrived without fanfare, quietly slipping past the curious glances of the staff who still buzzed over his previous visit. He found Eleanor in the garden courtyard, her thin hands brushing over the leaves of a half-dead rosebush. "Morning, Eleanor," Shaq greeted softly, crouching beside her. Eleanor looked up, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "You came back." Shaq settled onto the bench beside her. "I told you I would." He paused, measuring his words carefully. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something. Have you ever seen any paperwork about your house, your late husband's accounts?" Eleanor frowned faintly, shaking her head. No. Gerald handled most of that. And after he passed, Drew said he'd keep it all in order. I trusted him. She gave a sad little chuckle. Foolish. Maybe. Shaq placed a gentle hand over hers. Not foolish. Trusting. That's not a weakness. As they sat there, Shaq explained carefully, without overwhelming her, that some things weren't adding up. He didn't press too hard, didn't show her every painful detail. Not yet. But he wanted her to know that help was coming, that someone was in her corner now. Eleanor listened quietly, absorbing the truth slowly, her expression unreadable. I don't want to cause trouble, she murmured finally. Shaq's gaze softened. Eleanor's sometimes not causing trouble is how injustice grows. That afternoon, Connor worked relentlessly, pulling files, making calls, tracking Drew's web of transactions. Each new piece of evidence strengthened their case. There were forged signatures on bank documents, transfer records that bypassed Eleanor entirely, even a paper trail linking Drew to a shady property management company that specialized in flipping inherited homes without the rightful owner's knowledge. But there was a twist, and Connor spotted it first. Shaq, he said, pacing the office with a phone clutched tightly in one hand. There's a clause in the will, Gerald's will, he added, and an amendment 2 years before he died. Eleanor was supposed to have full control over the property and the life insurance. Drew was never supposed to touch it. Shaq's eyes sharpened, but Drew got around it.
Exactly.
Connor confirmed grimly. He faked Eleanor's consent. He's been forging her authorization on everything. Shaq exhaled slowly, feeling the pieces click into place. This wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was full-blown fraud, and now they had the evidence to prove it. By nightfall, Shaq stood outside on his balcony, staring over the glittering city lights. His mind churned through the next steps, weighing his options. He couldn't confront Drew directly. Not yet. That would tip their hand too soon. He needed to move carefully, set the stage for a takedown that couldn't be sidestepped or smoothed over. He thought about Eleanor, sitting quietly in that sterile nursing home, her life shrinking day by day, because someone she loved had chosen greed over family. He thought about the broader picture too, how many others like her were hidden away, erased, dismissed. Shaq's heart ached with the weight of it, but it also filled with resolve. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. This was about the principle. About standing up when the world looked away. As midnight neared, Shaq picked up his phone and called Connor. Let's get a legal team, he said quietly. A good one. Connor didn't hesitate. Already on it. Shaq leaned back, staring into the night. The storm was coming, and this time, it was one Drew wouldn't see coming. Not because of brute force, not because of celebrity, but because the truth had weight, and once it started moving, no amount of scheming could hold it back. The morning sun broke across Sunset Pines, gilding the old bricks and worn hedges in a kind of light they hadn't seen in years. Usually the nursing home stood quiet, its residents forgotten, the air thick with routine and slow decay. But today something was stirring. Staff bustled through the halls with unusual energy, volunteers rolled in folding tables and banners, and residents peered from their windows, whispering to each other in cautious excitement. Out in the parking lot, Shaquille O'Neal stood at the center of a small whirlwind, overseeing the setup for the family day event he'd thrown together in just 48 hours. His team worked swiftly, laying out picnic tables, setting up food trucks, arranging speakers, and stringing up colorful banners. Shaq knew how to command a crowd. It wasn't just about his name or fame, but the way he infused everything he touched with heart. And this time, his heart was all in for Eleanor. Connor hustled over, clipboard in hand, brow furrowed. We've got the media rolling in an hour. Local leaders confirmed, and even the mayor's sending a rep. Are you sure you want to draw this much attention? Shaq gave a slow, deliberate nod.
Yeah.
This isn't just about Eleanor anymore. This is about how we treat people like her. Like they don't matter once they're old, once they stop producing. I want eyes on this. By noon, the parking lot had transformed. Music floated through the air. Kids ran laughing between tables, and a mix of families, residents, and local supporters filled the space. Eleanor sat near the front, a little overwhelmed by the buzz but smiling faintly every time someone came up to greet her. She wasn't used to being the center of anything, certainly not after a week of being ignored, dismissed, and tucked away. Yet here she was, shaking hands with community leaders, accepting warm hugs from neighbors who hadn't known she'd been moved out of her home so abruptly. Shaq hovered nearby, watching the crowd with a quiet satisfaction. But not everything was smooth. A cluster of reporters gathered near the media area, their questions sharp-edged and pointed. "Mr. O'Neill, why are you putting so much energy into this one case?" one asked. Microphone thrust forward. "Mr. O'Neill, isn't it unusual for someone of your platform to get involved in private family matters?" Another pressed. And then came the line Shaq had been expecting and dreading. "Why Eleanor? Some are saying it's a curious choice. A black celebrity championing an older white woman's case. Is this a publicity move?" Shaq turned slowly, his broad frame casting a shadow over the reporter who'd asked the question. His eyes held steady, the weight of years of public scrutiny reflecting back. "Let me tell you something," Shaq said, his voice calm but resonant, carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "Love, respect, dignity. They don't stop at race. They don't stop at age. And they sure as hell don't stop at the point when someone's no longer profitable." The crowd quieted, tuning in. Even the kids stilled, sensing the tension ripple through the space. "This isn't about publicity," Shaq continued, stepping closer. "This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be the kind that looks away when someone gets discarded? Do we want to be the kind that lets racism, ageism, greed define how we treat each other? Because I don't." He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping across the cameras, the onlookers, the residents watching from their windows. "I didn't come here as a celebrity," Shaq said quietly. "I came here as a son, as a neighbor, as someone who believes we don't leave people behind just because it's convenient." The reporter shifted awkwardly, clearly unsure how to push back. Shaq didn't wait for another question. He turned, walking back to where Eleanor sat, gently resting a massive hand on her shoulder. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes shimmering faintly. "Thank you, Shaquille," she whispered. He gave her a small, warm smile. "You're not alone, Eleanor. Not anymore." As the afternoon rolled on, something remarkable began to unfold. Eleanor, usually shy and reserved, started opening up. People wanted to hear her story, not just the betrayal, but the life behind it. She spoke about her years of community service, the students she'd mentored, the gardens she'd tended, the small but meaningful ways she'd contributed to the fabric of her neighborhood. Slowly, people began to see her not as a passive victim, but as a vibrant part of their shared history, someone who deserved better than to be shut away. But the event wasn't without tension. Shaq noticed a group of skeptical onlookers near the back, faces he recognized from local politics. People who saw this gathering as an inconvenience, a disruption to the status quo. He caught snippets of their muttered conversations. "Why is he making this a circus? Rich athletes should stay in their lane. Can't fix every sad story." Shaq felt the familiar prickle of frustration. He'd faced this kind of dismissiveness before, the subtle racism that questioned his intelligence, his motives, his right to care about issues beyond basketball or business. But he'd long ago learned that the best response wasn't to lash out, it was to persist, to stand firm. Late in the day, as the sun dipped low and the event wound down, Shaq gathered the remaining crowd for a closing message. "Today wasn't just about one woman," he began, voice carrying strong and clear. "It was about all of us. About how we treat our elders. About how we confront the systems that let people slip through the cracks. We're not here to rescue anyone. We're here to remind each other what community looks like." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathering. "I've been blessed in my life. I've had opportunities most people can only dream of. But none of that matters if I don't use it to lift others. And I'm telling you right now, this isn't over. We're not stopping here." As the applause rose, Eleanor wiped at her eyes, a soft, astonished smile blooming on her face. She'd come to Sunset Pines, expecting to fade away. Now she found herself at the heart of something powerful, something shifting. Shaq crouched beside her one last time, voice low but steady. "We've got a legal team working on this, Eleanor. We're going to get you your home back, your life back. But today was about making sure you know you matter." Eleanor reached out, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "I do know, Shaquille. Because of you, I remember now." As the crowd dispersed and the last banners came down, Shaq stood alone for a moment, gazing up at the nursing home's brick facade. He knew there were battles ahead, legal fights, media storms, resistance from people who wanted this problem to quietly disappear. But he also knew something had shifted today. The community had rallied, eyes were open now. And once the truth started shining, there was no going back. Connor sat hunched over his laptop late into the night. the soft blue glow casting sharp shadows across his face. Files and records flickered on the screen, tabs stacked so thick they nearly crashed the machine. Shaq paced the room behind him, a restless giant, his heavy footsteps slow but deliberate, his mind churning. Something wasn't right, and they both knew it. The pieces just hadn't locked into place yet, but Connor was close. He could feel it. Shaq, Connor murmured, eyes narrowing as a document loaded. I think I found something. Shaq stopped, crossing his arms over his massive chest. Talk to me. Connor spun the screen around. Eleanor's late husband, Gerald. He updated his will 2 years before he died. Left everything to Eleanor. Full control of the house. The insurance. All of it. Drew wasn't even in the final version. Shaq leaned forward slowly, brow furrowing. Then how the hell has Drew been moving money around? Connor clicked through another series of files. For Jory. He's been faking Eleanor's consent. Signing her name on documents. Shifting assets. Making it look like she authorized the transfers. He exhaled, shaking his head. This wasn't negligence. This was a long con. Shaq's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. The anger that simmered beneath his surface surged, but he forced himself to stay still. No use punching walls. No use charging in blind. This needed strategy. Connor closed the laptop softly. So what's the move? Shaq's eyes glinted. We set the trap. The next day, Drew stood on the patio of Eleanor's old house. Sunglasses perched on his head, a drink in hand. His phone buzzed, and when he checked the screen, a smirk crept across his face. Shaquille O'Neal, of all people, had just invited him to a charity gala. Drew chuckled softly. What the hell does Shaq want with me? Drew muttered, shaking his head. But curiosity and ego tugged at him. The idea of rubbing elbows with a celebrity, the chance to spin the narrative in his favor, maybe even make a few connections, was too tempting to ignore. That evening, under the glimmering lights of the downtown event hall, Shaq worked the room with practiced grace. Photographers flashed their cameras, guests mingled, drinks flowed. But Shaq's mind stayed sharp, his focus locked. He wasn't here for small talk tonight. When Drew arrived, all smooth charm and expensive cologne, Shaq greeted him with a firm handshake and a knowing smile. Glad you could make it, Drew. Wouldn't miss it, Drew said easily, flashing a grin. Big fan, by the way. Shaq gave a small nod. Yeah? Well, I'm a fan of truth. He let the words hang just long enough to shift the air between them. Drew laughed it off, but his smile tightened. Just a fraction. Truth, huh? Well, nothing wrong on my end. Shaq's eyes didn't waver. We'll see. As the evening unfolded, Shaq made sure to keep Drew close, weaving subtle questions into the conversation, watching for the telltale flickers of nervousness, the darting eyes, the forced laughter, the defensive posturing, and sure enough, Drew began to crack. When Connor joined them, shaking Drew's hand with a polite smile, the pressure deepened. Connor had a way of slipping details into conversation that seemed casual but landed with quiet weight. He mentioned Eleanor's name, casually referenced the updated will, lightly commented on the legal team reviewing the estate records. Drew's facade held, but only just. His laughter grew a little too loud, his charm a little too sharp, his excuses a little too eager, and beneath it all, Shaq saw the truth flickering in his eyes. Panic. Later that night, as guests filtered out, Shaq stood alone on the balcony, overlooking the city skyline. Connor joined him, slipping a folder into his hands. All the forged documents, Connor murmured. Signed, dated, traced back to Drew. We've got him, Shaq. Shaq exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. But he knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. We don't go public yet, Shaq said softly. We let him sweat. Let him think the walls are closing in. When we hit clean. Connor nodded, understanding immediately. You want him to feel it first. Shaq turned his gaze back to the city. Yeah. I want him to know exactly why he's falling before he hits the ground. Meanwhile, back at Sunset Pines, Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. She had no idea what Shaq was orchestrating, no idea the trap being set in her name, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a strange, tentative sense of peace. Something had shifted, even if she couldn't see it yet. Drew, on the other hand, felt the shift acutely. As he sat alone in Eleanor's old house that night, drink in hand, phone buzzing with unanswered calls, A creeping unease coiled in his gut. He told himself he was imagining things, that Shaq's questions had been harmless, that the references to the will were coincidence. But the knot in his stomach tightened with every passing hour. And that was the genius of Shaq's approach. He didn't need to storm in with accusations. He didn't need to shout or threaten. He let the truth do the heavy lifting. As the clock ticked past midnight, Drew paced the empty living room, muttering under his breath, trying to piece together his next move. But the walls were closing in, whether he realized it or not, and Shaq, calm and steady, was ready for the next step. The hallways of Sunset Pines were dimly lit, the hum of the night shift a quiet backdrop of shuffling feet and muted whispers. Eleanor sat awake in her room, heart uneasy. She had sensed something shifting over the past few days. Not just the whispers among staff about the sudden media attention, or the bursts of community visitors checking in after the family day event, but something darker, a subtle gnawing dread that she couldn't name but couldn't shake. And then, late into the night, there was a knock. Not the gentle knock of a nurse checking in, not the soft tap of a fellow resident. It was sharper, more impatient, landing against the wood of her door with a rhythm that made her stomach twist. "May," came the voice. Low, hurried, tense. "It's me. Open up." Eleanor froze. Drew. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly, as she reached for the doorknob. She wasn't sure why she opened the door. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was hope. But the moment she saw his face, sharp and pale in the low hallway light, her chest tightened. Drew slipped inside quickly, glancing over his shoulder, as if checking for witnesses. His smile was brittle, his eyes darting. "Ma, we need to talk." Eleanor took a cautious step back. "Drew, it's late. What are you doing here?" He closed the door softly behind him, his whole body coiled with nervous energy. I just need you to sign something, all right? It's no big deal, just some paperwork for the house, to make things easier." Eleanor's heart pounded harder. "I thought you already took care of the house." Drew's eyes flickered, the faintest slip, before he plastered on another smile. "Well, yeah, mostly. This is just a cleanup thing. Some final rites. You don't need to understand it, Ma. Just trust me." Trust. The word hit her like a stone. She swallowed hard, hands shaking as she fumbled for the edge of the table, needing something to hold on to. "I don't know, Drew," she whispered. "I think maybe we should wait." Drew's smile faltered. "Wait? For what, Ma? This isn't complicated." His voice sharpened, slipping into that edge she remembered too well, the one he used when he didn't want to be questioned. "You're making it harder than it needs to be." Eleanor felt the room closing in, her breath tightening. And then, like a faint echo, she remembered the small card tucked in her bedside drawer, the one Shaq had given her, with his personal number scribbled across it. Just in case, he'd told her with that calm, steady voice. She'd kept it, half out of gratitude, half out of disbelief that she'd ever need it. Her fingers, trembling, slid toward the drawer, as Drew pulled out a pen, placing it carefully on the paper in front of her. "Just sign, Ma," he murmured, his tone dipping lower. "Come on, we don't want to make this messy, do we?" Heart pounding so loud she thought it might give her away. Eleanor slipped the card from the drawer, her thumb hovering over the numbers. Drew turned for just a second, distracted by a sound in the hallway, and in that fragile moment, Eleanor pressed the call button. Across town, Shaq had been restless, pacing his living room, phone in hand. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was brewing, that Drew was too quiet. So when his phone lit up with Eleanor's name, he answered on the first ring. "Eleanor," he said, voice instantly alert. There was no reply, just a faint rustle, the softest whisper of breath. Shaq's stomach clenched. "I'm on my way," he said firmly, grabbing his keys. Back at Sunset Pines, Eleanor tried to stall, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Maybe we should read through it together, Drew. Maybe someone could explain it." Drew's jaw tightened. "Ma, don't make this difficult." But the moment stretched too long. The silence grew too thick. Drew's eyes flicked to her hand, to the phone she was barely holding under the table. His expression shifted, the mask slipping just for a heartbeat, revealing raw, simmering frustration. "Are you calling someone?" he hissed, stepping forward. And then from the hallway came the sound of heavy footsteps. Drew's head snapped up, panic flaring across his face. What the hell? The door swung open, and Shaq filled the doorway, his massive frame cutting a commanding silhouette against the dim hall light. His eyes locked instantly on Eleanor, then on Drew, reading the fear in both their faces like an open book. Drew, Shaq said evenly, voice low but unmistakably firm. You need to leave. Drew's mouth opened, closed. 100 slick excuses dying on his tongue. For the first time, the charm faltered completely, replaced by raw panic. Without a word, he shoved past Shaq, bolting for the hallway, disappearing into the night like a shadow fleeing the sun. Shaq didn't chase. He didn't need to. His focus was entirely on Eleanor, who sat trembling, her thin shoulders shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. He moved slowly, carefully, kneeling down beside her, placing one large, steady hand over hers. It's okay, Shaq murmured softly. You're safe now. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, a single tear slipping down her cheek. He was here, Shaquille. He wanted me to sign everything away. Shaq gave her a gentle, reassuring squeeze. He's not getting away with it, Eleanor. I promise you. This isn't over. As the night deepened outside, Shaq stayed by Eleanor's side, quietly calling Connor to update him, setting plans into motion. There was no need for raised voices, no need for confrontation. The truth was stronger than that, and soon, Drew would discover that no amount of running could outrun what was coming for him. For the first time in days, Eleanor allowed herself to lean back, her breath slowing, her eyes closing just slightly. Shaq was here. The storm was here. And finally, the tide was turning. By dawn, Shaq sat at his long dining table, his laptop open, phone in hand, fingers drumming thoughtfully on the wood. Connor sat across from him, bleary-eyed but sharp, tapping away at his tablet. The night's events had shaken Eleanor, no doubt, but they had also solidified Shaq's resolve. This wasn't just about a quiet legal battle anymore. It was time to take the fight public. Are you sure about this? Connor asked cautiously, glancing up. Once you put this out there, there's no reeling it back in. Shaq exhaled, his broad shoulders tense. Yeah, I'm sure. People need to see what's happening, not just to Eleanor but to countless others like her. If we let Drew operate in the dark, he'll keep pulling strings. I want light on this. Connor nodded, understanding. Okay, let's make it airtight. With Eleanor's blessing, a shaky but determined yes. Shaquille, tell them, over the phone. Shaq crafted the post himself. He didn't want a PR team spinning it, didn't want gloss or polish. He wanted raw truth. He attached a photo, Eleanor in her small, tidy room, hands folded in her lap, eyes gentle but tired. And beneath it his words, this is Eleanor. She's 68, a retired school volunteer, widow, mother. She was abandoned in a nursing home by the son she raised as her own, who has been secretly selling off her home and assets without her knowledge. This isn't just her story, it's the story of too many elders, too many families shattered by greed and neglect. We can do better. We must do better. Justice for Eleanor. Stand up for our seniors. Shaq hit post. Within minutes, the post caught fire. First came the comments. A flood of outrage, sympathy, disbelief. People shared their own stories. My grandmother went through the same thing. We almost lost my dad's house to a shady caretaker. Thank you, Shaq, for speaking up. Then came the retweets, the shares, the viral explosion. By noon, major news outlets had picked up the post. Headlines blared across social media. Shaq calls out family fraud, fights for abandoned elderly woman. Camera crews began parking outside Sunset Pines. Reporters scrambled to get statements. Shaq stood firm through it all. He wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for pressure, for weight, for enough public outcry to force Drew and his legal team into the open. And it worked. By late afternoon, Drew's carefully curated world was unraveling. His name, once polished and untouchable in local business circles, was now splashed across headlines, not as a rising star but as a con artist. A fraud. His phone buzzed endlessly with reporters, creditors, former allies demanding answers. His lawyers, sleek and expensive, scrambled to control the fallout, moving fast to freeze remaining accounts, secure assets, spin the narrative before it crashed completely. But the tide was already shifting. At Sunset Pines, Eleanor sat by the window, watching the media trucks gather outside, the sudden surge of attention she never expected. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned away, overwhelmed. She didn't hear the door open, but she felt Shaq's presence, a quiet, grounding force. He crouched beside her gently, his large hand resting over hers. I never thought anyone would fight for me, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. Shaq's eyes softened. You deserve it, Eleanor. You always did. For a long moment, she simply let the tears fall. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady release. Shaq stayed beside her, steady as a rock, letting her lean into his strength. Outside, the world swirled. News anchors framed the story as a battle of family betrayal, elder neglect, racial unity. Some raised skeptical eyebrows. Why would a famous black athlete get involved in the affairs of an old white woman? But Shaq didn't flinch when the reporters came, when the microphones appeared. He stood tall, delivering his message with unshakable clarity. This isn't about color, he told them calmly. This isn't about money. It's about dignity. About who we are when no one's watching. About standing up for people who can't stand alone. The more Shaq spoke, the harder it became for Drew's team to twist the narrative. The facts were solid. The forged documents were undeniable. The public had latched onto the heart of the story. Eleanor's quiet resilience, Shaq's unwavering defense, the simple power of one person stepping up when it mattered. That night, as Eleanor settled into bed, her room now filled with cards, flowers, and letters from strangers across the country, Shaq stood at the window, watching the stars. Connor joined him, phone in hand.
You did it, Connor murmured. You turned the tide.
Shaq didn't smile, didn't relax. We're not done yet. Because Shaq knew, public attention was one thing, but legal justice was another. Drew's lawyers were already maneuvering behind the scenes, trying to shield him, delay proceedings, shift blame. It was a chess match now, and Shaq was determined to play it to the end. He turned, glancing back at Eleanor's sleeping figure. We're gonna see this through, he said softly. For her, for all the people like her. Connor nodded, resolve sharpening in his eyes. Let's finish this. And as the moon hung high over the city, Shaq felt the weight of the fight settle fully on his shoulders. But he welcomed it. Because some battles were worth every ounce of strength you had. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed under Shaq's slow, deliberate steps as he entered the packed courtroom, towering over reporters, spectators, and local figures jostling for a view. His tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his massive shoulders. Beside him, Eleanor clutched his arm tightly, her small frame dwarfed by his, her breath shallow as she took in the grand room, the raised judge's bench, the rows of polished wooden pews filled with strangers eager to witness the drama unfold. Stay with me, Eleanor, Shaq murmured softly, his deep voice cutting through the buzzing atmosphere. You've got this. Eleanor nodded faintly, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Drew sat flanked by two sharply dressed attorneys, their suits crisp, their expressions cold and calculating. Drew lounged in his chair with a confident smirk, tapping his polished shoe against the floor, whispering something smug to his lawyers. His eyes flicked toward Eleanor and Shaq, and lingered, daring. Mom. Shaq didn't flinch. As the judge entered, the room snapped to order. Papers shuffled, murmurs ceased, and the tension tightened like a coiled spring. Shaq's legal team, hand-picked and funded quietly over the past few weeks, was led by a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Rachel Grant. She was fierce, focused, and had come prepared for war. She began with a calm, measured opening, laying out the facts: Eleanor's amended inheritance, the forged documents, the fraudulent property transfers. On the other side, Drew's lawyers painted Eleanor as confused, elderly, incapable of managing her own affairs, a narrative designed to cast doubt on everything. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap as the opposing side spoke. Shaq leaned down, whispering in her ear, "Trust the truth, Eleanor. It's stronger than they are." Then the evidence came. Rachel presented the forged signatures side by side, pointing out inconsistencies, showing how Eleanor's name had been replicated on documents she'd never seen. She called in a handwriting expert who broke down, in excruciating detail, how Drew's team had faked authorization on key transfers. Bank records were displayed, tracing the flow of Eleanor's assets into Drew's personal accounts. Drew's confident smirk began to crack. His lawyer scrambled, raising objections, trying to shift blame, suggesting maybe it had been a clerical error, maybe a misunderstanding, maybe Eleanor had agreed, but forgotten. But Rachel was relentless. Then came the twist no one in the room saw coming. Rachel called Connor to the stand. Calm and composed, Connor detailed the investigative process that had uncovered Drew's web of lies, and then, producing a series of recorded phone calls and emails, showed how Drew had not only orchestrated the scheme, but bragged about it to close contacts. The recordings played over the speakers, Drew's own voice filling the courtroom. She'll never know. She's old. It's easy money. A hush fell over the room. Drew's face drained of color. Eleanor covered her mouth, eyes brimming with tears, shaking her head softly in disbelief. Shaq placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her, his eyes never leaving Drew. As the closing arguments wrapped, the judge called a brief recess before delivering the verdict. Eleanor and Shaq stepped into the hallway, where media swarmed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Shaq shielded Eleanor, blocking the frenzy with his broad frame, whispering reassurances as they waited. Inside, Drew sat stiffly, his charm fully stripped away, his lawyers whispering frantically, their confidence visibly shaken. Finally, the judge returned. Everyone rose. Silence thickened the air. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The judge's voice was steady, unwavering as she spoke. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the presented documentation, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Eleanor Mayfield. All property, accounts and assets are hereby restored to her rightful ownership. Further investigation into the defendant's fraudulent actions will proceed under separate criminal review. Eleanor gasped softly, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She covered her face for a moment, overwhelmed. Shaq leaned in close, whispering with a soft, proud smile, "You did it, Eleanor." She looked up at him, voice trembling. "No, Shaquille, we did." As the courtroom began to stir, reporters rushing to file stories, Drew being quickly ushered out by his panicked lawyers, Eleanor's legal team exchanging quiet, satisfied nods. Shaq and Eleanor remained still, savoring the moment. It wasn't just about money, or property, or even justice on paper. It was about reclaiming dignity, about standing up when the world expected silence. Reporters rushed forward, microphones thrust out. "Mr. O'Neill, what does this victory mean to you?" one asked breathlessly. Shaq paused, glancing down at Eleanor, then back at the cameras. "This isn't my victory," he said calmly. "This is Eleanor's, and it's a reminder to all of us. No one, no matter their age, no matter their circumstance, deserves to be discarded or exploited. We rise by lifting others, and today, that's exactly what happened." Eleanor, still clutching Shaq's arm, gave a small, grateful smile. As they moved through the crowd, the weight of the moment settled over them, not as a burden, but as a triumph. The legal battle was over, but the fight for dignity, for respect, for justice, that was the real victory, the one that echoed beyond any courtroom. And as the sun set over the courthouse, Eleanor knew, deep in her heart, that she was no longer alone. The air outside Sunset Pines carried a sense of weightless anticipation, a hush that spread across the small crowd gathered at the entrance. Reporters stood ready, cameras angled and microphones lifted, waiting for the shot they'd been promised. On the steps of the nursing home, Eleanor stood, shoulders squared, a faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted the hem of her pale blue coat. Shaquille O'Neal stood beside her, offering his arm. His giant frame was relaxed but alert, his eyes gentle as they met hers. "You ready, Eleanor?" he asked quietly. With the sun warming their backs and the crowd holding its breath, Eleanor stepped forward, arm hooked through Shaq's. As they descended the stairs together, cameras flashed, shutters clicked, and people clapped softly, some cheering, others simply smiling, as they watched this woman, this quiet, resilient woman, walk free, her dignity restored, her life hers again. Shaq kept pace beside her, steady and unhurried. He didn't wave for the cameras, didn't grandstand. He stayed focused on Eleanor, making sure every step was strong, every moment her. She paused briefly at the bottom of the steps, glancing back once at the building that had been her cage, and her crucible. Then she turned forward and kept walking, the breeze lifting her silver hair like a small, private crown. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's story spread far beyond the local headlines. National outlets ran features on her journey, highlighting the broader issue of elder neglect, family betrayal, and the often invisible struggles of seniors cast aside by those they trusted most. But Eleanor didn't want fame, and she certainly didn't want pity. Instead, she wanted purpose. Sitting with Shaq one afternoon, tucked into a cozy corner of a bustling community center, Eleanor sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I want to give back, Shaquille," she said softly. "Not just to say thank you, but because there are so many others like me, so many people who don't get saved in time." Shaq leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Eleanor, you don't owe anyone anything. But if you want to help, I think you'd change lives. And so, she did. Eleanor donated a significant portion of her recovered wealth to Shaq's charitable foundation, earmarking it specifically for programs supporting abandoned and vulnerable seniors. Together they launched a new initiative, Second Sunrise, a project providing legal aid, housing support, and community connections for elders in need. The launch event drew huge crowds, but Eleanor insisted on keeping her speech simple. Standing on the small stage, she clutched the microphone in both hands and looked out over the sea of faces. I thought my story was ending, she said quietly. I thought I was done. But what I've learned is that no matter how late it feels, we can all begin again. And when we help each other begin again, that's when we're truly alive. Applause roared through the hall, but Eleanor only smiled shyly, her eyes shining as she stepped back, Shaq greeting her with a proud fatherly embrace. As for Drew, he vanished from public view almost overnight. The court ruling stripped him of the wealth he'd stolen, his former friends and business partners distancing themselves quickly as the scandal deepened. No criminal charges had yet landed. The investigations were ongoing, but his reputation was ruined, his influence dissolved. Eleanor never asked about him again. She didn't need to. She had walked away from that shadow, and she wasn't going back. One evening, not long after the program launch, Shaq and Eleanor sat quietly on the front porch of a small house Eleanor had chosen for herself, not as grand as her old home, but cozy, welcoming, filled with light. They watched the neighborhood children race up and down the street, their laughter echoing through the twilight. The air was soft, cool, scented faintly with blooming jasmine. Eleanor wrapped her cardigan a little tighter around her shoulders, eyes glistening as she watched the kids play. I never imagined this, Shaquille, she murmured, not just surviving but feeling alive again. Shaq turned to her, a soft grin tugging at his mouth. You saved your own life, Eleanor. I just showed up when you were ready. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're a good man, Shaquille. You remind the world what goodness looks like. He let out a quiet laugh. And you remind the world what strength looks like. They sat in easy silence for a while, watching the sunset bleed pink and gold across the sky, the streetlights flickering on one by one. Eleanor leaned back, her heart full, her spirit light. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the next blow, the next disappointment, the next loss. She was simply here, whole, steady, and surrounded by a new kind of family. As the last of the light slipped beyond the horizon, Eleanor turned to Shaq, her voice soft but sure. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Shaq shook his head, his grin widening. You don't have to thank me, Eleanor. You already did the hardest part. And as they sat there, two souls from different worlds bound by something deeper than circumstance, they both knew the truth. The hardest battles were the ones you fought inside, the ones no one saw. And the greatest victories were the ones where you emerged, not just standing, but shining. The night deepened around them, the stars spilling across the sky, and somewhere nearby, a child's laughter carried softly on the wind. Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing it in, feeling it settle deep into her bones. This new beginning, this second sunrise, this life she had reclaimed. And beside her, Shaq sat quietly, smiling into the night, knowing that sometimes the biggest wins come not from trophies or fame, but from standing beside someone when they need you most, and reminding them they were never alone. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Carry its message into your own life. Look around. Whose dignity needs defending? Whose voice is waiting to be heard? Every community, every block, every family holds unseen stories. Be the one who shows up when no one else will. Because real change doesn't come from watching. It comes from stepping in and standing tall.